Hello. Today we're going to be talking about addressing intergroup anxiety to move forward with an equity agenda. My name is Dan Jesse, and I'm a principal analysis person at the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center. The Western Educational Equity Assistance Center serves 13 states and 3 territories. If you look at the map there, you'll see we serve from Montana down to New Mexico and everything west, including Alaska, Hawaii, and 3 territories. We're one of 4 regional educational equity assistance centers funded by the U.S. Department of Education, authorized under the Title IV of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're not really selling anything here. Our services are free or at low cost to K-12 entities in the Western region, and our contact information is there. So today's session goals are basically to define intergroup anxiety, give a rationale for using this theory for addressing bias. We're also going to outline some potential strategies for addressing bias that are suggested by the theory, and we're going to provide some suggestions for future directions. So a little bit of background. Obviously, we're in some turbulent times these days with the Black Lives Matter movement that we're all aware of, the murder of George Floyd, more recently the Kenosha shootings here in Aurora, Colorado, where is close to the Denver area where we're headquartered. We're having some incidents here as well, and the list continues. There's lots of incidents, and we really need to do something to address all of this. So a little bit more background here. The United States is changing in terms of demographics. The U.S. white population is shrinking. The proportion of Americans who are non-Hispanic white has been dropping for several decades, as you can see by this chart. Going back to the year 1800, you can see that during the 1900s, 1920, 1940, the percentage of whites in the United States grew a little bit, but now you can see at least from like 1960 to 2020, the white population is dropping, and that's been happening for several decades. Here's another look at the same sort of information. This is declining white population. We have changing mortality rates. For non-Hispanic white people in the United States, you can see the annual number of deaths has outpaced the number of births for whites. And you can see right now that the births are lower than the deaths, starting sometime after 2014.
Okay, so now you should be getting the idea that our demographics are changing, and these changes are not going to be turning around anytime soon. In fact, the days of the whites being the minority or the majority in group are probably limited, and that's not going to turn around for some time. If you take a look at this slide, it shows the changes in 14 states in terms of population. These are the quote-unquote least white states. If you look at the top there all the way down to the bottom, you can see that there are a lot of states that have lower than the national average of whites across the nation. And this is not going to change anytime soon. These patterns are pretty stable in terms of what they mean for the reduction in the percentage of white population in these states. So there is a canon, quote unquote, that's emerging in very recent years, in the last couple of years for sure. And since the murder of George Floyd, this has really become popular stuff. The Black Lives Matter canon is a set of books that basically people are reading who want to become educated about anti-racism and the actual implications of that. The first is How to Be an Anti-Racist, and this book is actually very popular, New York Times bestseller list, and the author is a well-known national speaker who has spoken to educators all across the country. The next book is White Fragility. This is basically a book that talks about the sensitivities that you need to be aware of in terms of how white people are going to react to accusations of racism and how you can counter that. For every argument you might come up with in terms of white fragility, in terms of white racism, white people might tend to come back with a counter answer. And this book talks about what those answers are likely to be and how you might respond to them. And then the third book, the one I actually like the best, talks about multicultural curriculum and racism in terms of how the brain functions. This is actually a very useful book. In fact, when I read this, I got really excited to see the glossary. That's a nice place in this book to start. by looking at this particular publication and looking at the glossary, you can get a very quick and dirty crash course on how the brain functions under various types of stress and under various types of emotional discourse that is typical in terms of these discussions that we need to have now about racism. So I also suggest taking a good look at the second chapter in that book, a nice little piece on how the brain functions and how you might actually use that information in a school setting. Here are some things, as I mentioned before in the White Fragility book. These are things that white people might say when you start to talk to them about racism. And basically, there's two different categories here. In one sense, people might say, I treat everyone the same. Whenever we hear that, it's a red flag for us at the Equity Center. We know that there are some racism issues that are deep down and actually need to be dealt with. We also know that when we hear the phrase, I don't see color, the same sorts of issues are going on. There's some cognitive dissonance there in terms of what's going on, and we need to actually delve into that a little more. I am not a racist. That's going to actually set off some alarms as well, because you really cannot grow up in America and not be racist and sexist. This stuff is everywhere. It's in the media, and it's been in the radio way before there was television. It was in publications way before that. And of course, we have a long history of racism and sexism in the United States. And if you are really aware, you're not going to be denying that this exists, and you wouldn't say something like, I'm not a racist. Everybody's racist to a certain extent. You just can't get around it in today's culture. And then also, if you hear the phrase, you are playing the race card, that's sort of a defensive comment that someone might make. Over on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see there's some other sorts of comments that people might make when they're confronted with racism. White people might say something like, for example, like, I marched in the 60s, or I have black friends, or I have suffered too, or if you knew me, you would know I am not a racist. These are also indicative of some issues and sort of in a different category, which we'll explain in a minute. So this comes from the Kendi book. This is the one I mentioned that is very popular now. These are three different kinds of anti-racism views. The assimilationist views are basically the racist idea that a group is inferior and needs to deal with cultural or behavioral enrichment programs to develop the group. The assumption here is that there is something wrong that needs to be corrected. And this is really a racist idea. Segregationist ideas are basically the racist idea of permanent inferiority and supporting policy that segregates. And of course, we have a long history of that in the United States, way before there was even a nation here, and going on even before that. This is a long and persistent problem. And then anti-racist. If you're really going to get there to be an anti-racist, you have to talk about racial groups being equals. No one needs to be developing. There's nothing wrong with any particular group. And supporting policy to reduce inequity. These are big issues here. And the issue is, for a white person, unless you're starting to take action on these things, you really can't call yourself an anti-racist. Unless you've really paid for something, you're really going to have an issue in terms of your racist ideas and that sort of thing. And my own personal experience, I've lost jobs because I took on racism. I've lost prime work assignments because I took on racism. I've also lost committee memberships. I've been thrown off of state committees because I dealt with racist issues. I remember being in a meeting with one of my supervisors at one of the organizations I worked at in the past, where he said, we were talking about equity and how Hispanics were overclassified for disciplinary issues. And he said, well, what if they're all carrying knives? At that very point in time, I knew that my professional relationship with this particular individual and the organization changed forever.
Now we're going to move on to intergroup anxiety. This comes from Dr. Walter Stephan from New Mexico State University. Back in the 1980s, I was a graduate student in the New Mexico State University Department of Psychology in the Applied Social Psychology program, and Dr. Stephan was one of the professors there. He and his wife, Cookie Stephan, are research team. Walter is a social psychologist, and Cookie is basically a sociologist. And their research history goes way back for many years, many decades. This all started like in 1985. If you take a look at the Journal of Social Issues, the idea of intergroup anxiety was first talked about there. The Stephans basically put this together. Walter was at a conference somewhere, and someone asked him, when you're looking at desegregated schools, why don't the black students and the white students interact? And he started thinking about that and came up with this term called intergroup anxiety. And this has been heavily researched for like a quarter of a century, and we're going to talk about a little of that. The next publication here is actually a chapter in this book, Education Programs for Improving Intergroup Relations. This is where Walter and Cookie and someone else put together a meta-analysis of programs that were designed to improve intergroup relations. Kind of the bottom line behind those programs was intergroup contact was key in terms of making these things work. And there was also a notion going around at that time that if you behave in a certain way, then your attitudes will change. If you interact with groups of a different subculture than your own, you start to develop some attitudes that are more positive. So there were some ideas behind that. And so they designed some interventions around that, and we'll briefly talk about that. And as I mentioned, this has been researched for a long time. More recently, Walter Stephan put together a summary of a lot of that research and pulled together a theory in 2014, which was published in this Personality and Social Psychology Review, and we'll get into the details of some of these publications. This is a multicultural education programs meta-analysis, as I mentioned. The two Stephans and someone else put this together, taking a look at a whole bunch of different studies and calculating statistics in terms of, okay, what does this really mean? What you do in a meta-analysis is you calculate an effect size. And they figured out that multicultural education programs that were designed for attitude change had sort of like a medium effect size, and programs that were designed for behavior change had sort of a medium effect size. But when you started looking at the long-term impacts of these programs, delayed attitude change, the effect size became very large, and the delayed behavior change also became very large. I'm thinking that these programs were effective because as soon as the intervention was over, people got out in the field or the classroom or whatever setting they were in and started exploring what some of this meant for them. And as time went on, they began to grow in terms of their attitudes and behaviors, and you started to see some larger effects. So this is actually very encouraging news. We can overcome these issues if we design the right kinds of programs and implement them. And these are not programs to fix minority people. These are programs to deal with intergroup anxiety and also some other issues. So it's important to look at this, knowing that it's promising that this actually can make a difference. So what is this thing I'm talking about in terms of intergroup anxiety? Basically, intergroup anxiety happens when people experience situations where they're anticipating or engaging in intergroup interaction. For example, this is when white people think they're going to be interacting with black people in some sort of setting. And this can actually lead to some intergroup anxiety. It turns out if white people have a certain kind of bias or prejudice or even some racist attitudes that they're harboring, this intergroup anxiety goes way up. And this is not restricted to just white people and black people. It's characteristic of in-groups and out-groups, and it can happen in a variety of settings. For example, between Chinese people and Canadians, you can see this sort of thing happen. And why do we talk about it? Well, intergroup anxiety helps us understand why such interactions are often more complicated and difficult than interactions with in-group members. If we start understanding some of the psychology behind this, maybe we're in a better position to deal with the stressors that we're facing today. Another thing that we'll just talk about very briefly, some of the research. Blacks and whites worry that intergroup interactions will be negative or will have negative outcomes. This is particularly true if they have little experience interacting with each other. And it also occurs not only with relations between blacks and whites, but also other social groups, as I mentioned, in-groups, out-groups, various cultures. And it also, this concept of intergroup anxiety helps us understand why intergroup interactions are often more complicated and difficult than interactions with in-group members. So Walter's latest theoretical approach to this is that intergroup anxiety is comprised of three interrelated components: the affect or the feeling component, the cognitive or the thinking component, and then the physiological or biological component. And we're going to talk about that in some detail. Walter Stephan also suggests that intergroup anxiety is caused by 4 different types of factors. It's personality traits and related personal characteristics. Some of these are transient or changeable or malleable, and some of them are more or less pretty well established. Negative attitudes and related cognitions can contribute to intergroup anxiety. Personal experiences can relate to intergroup anxiety, and situational factors, of course, can relate to intergroup anxiety. Some of these are stable and some of these are unstable. And influences are, of course, cognitions, what you're thinking about the situation, affect, how you feel about a particular situation, and behavior. The behavior one is actually pretty interesting because we're working with a group that has been working in Alabama with Black students and figured out that teachers in some of these classrooms had low expectations for Black students, but when the consultants went and worked with them, they said, you know what, these kids actually can do this higher order stuff. Here, let me show you. And when the consultants would show them, the teachers, that if they did certain math practices with Black students that involved higher order thinking skills or high expectations, they would rise to the occasion. And then the teachers would try it and they'd say, you know what, I guess you're right. When I tried this, the kids actually rose to the occasion and did better. So that's sort of like an influence that we think is kind of important and worth looking at in the future in more detail. We won't get into that in this presentation, but it is certainly something to think about. So I'm going to go back to a theory that has been around for 20, 30 years, Paul MacLean's triune brain. This is actually a very useful theory. It had a lot of resilience. Of course, people have refuted it and come up with more complex explanations for what's going on, as we now have PET scans and tomography and all these biological markers and that sort of thing. We understand the brain a little better. And what we know about the brain is that we don't know a lot about the brain, but this is actually kind of useful. The reptilian brain is the simplest system. It's the oldest system. It's the fastest operating system. It's the system that obviously is characteristic of reptiles. The paleo-mammalian or the mammalian brain is the feeling brain or the affective brain. And then the neo-mammalian brain is basically the higher order thinking skills brain or the cognitive part of the brain. This is an oversimplification, but this theory of the triune brain has been with us for a long time and helps explain some of the things that are going on with things like intergroup anxiety. So again, an old idea, persistent, reptilian. This is the part of the brain that says, don't touch the hot stove. In fact, if you touch a hot stove, the reptilian brain is going to kick in and say, get your hand off the stove right away. Before it even gets all the way up to the brain, it's going to be processed in parts of the spinal column to say, pull your hand off that hot burner. The mammalian brain is the affective brain, the feeling brain. If you've ever been in a staff meeting in a school setting, for example, and everybody's upset about something, no matter what you're trying to cover in that staff meeting, they're going to keep talking about that particular issue, and it's going to basically shut down the whole meeting because of affect. For example, one time I went to a school and presented on how they were doing so well on test scores, but right before I got up there, the principal said, we're going to lose a couple of positions. We don't know who's going to lose their jobs, but we'll talk about that later. Dan, you're up. Well, they didn't hear a word I had to say because they were all worried about, is it me? Is it my friend? Who's going to lose their job? That sort of thing can really shut down higher order thinking skills, which is what happens in the neo-mammalian brain or the HOTS brain, higher order thinking skills. And again, I should mention, as with a lot of neuroscience, everything we used to know is wrong, or at least a lot more complicated than we thought it was. But this is just basically a simple way to help us understand a little bit about what's going on with intergroup anxiety. I mentioned the Hammond book, the Zaretta Hammond book. That's a great book. This is a book that talks about biological factors, psychobiological factors in terms of working with groups of students in the classroom, but it has some application to our particular setting. What I liked about this book was that the second chapter in there was really good and explained a lot of brain functioning. And what was really helpful for me was to go to that glossary in that book and read the glossary first, because it defines all these great terms that you may or may not know, which are essential to understand how the brain operates in not only things like trauma, but in classrooms for higher order thinking skills and complicated situations like intergroup anxiety. So basically, I'm guessing here. I don't know if this is right, and I'm sure someone will tell me it is not. But basically, I thought the autonomic nervous system was basically the reptilian brain we were talking about before. The limbic region, I thought that was the mammalian brain that we were mentioning before. And the prefrontal cortex is the neo-mammalian brain. I'm guessing based on Hammond's definitions that at least this is close. It might not be entirely accurate, and so, of course, a whole lot more complicated. But if we just think about this in these simple categories, it helps us understand intergroup anxiety. So what is cortisol? Well, cortisol is primary stress hormone. You can measure cortisol in some pretty simple ways now. You can measure it in saliva. And basically, we're going to be talking a lot about this because there's some interesting experiments that have been done that are pretty revealing in terms of how the body reacts to stress. When the body's under stress, it will produce this hormone. It doesn't say why you're under stress and why the hormone is being produced. And there are also some other complicating interactive biological factors that we're not going to get into here. But these studies of cortisol are actually pretty interesting and revealing. It turns out that cortisol, if you are chronically exposed to stress, it will reduce your working memory. Without getting into the cognitive psychology of all of it, working memory is very important for learning and higher order thinking skills. It's still theoretical, and there's some controversies around it, but it does reduce the functioning of working memory when you're chronically exposed to stress, and as that's evidenced by cortisol. Cortisol is also something that goes up when you're chronically exposed to stress in terms of the immune system. If you have a lot of cortisol going on in your body, your immune system will be weakened. And this is also an explanation for trauma as well, which is another topic. And again, it can be found in saliva, so it's easy to measure when you're in an experimental setting. You don't have to do blood tests or anything like that.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about intergroup anxiety effects. And basically, as I mentioned before, stress can be measured by cortisol levels, and this can be influenced by intergroup anxiety. This is a biological measure of stress, so to speak. That's an oversimplification in terms of what we really know about biopsychology, but it is a way to measure whether someone is under stress by gathering some information that's objective. When you measure cortisol, you're going to see some very unique patterns, although it's a lot more complicated than that. It is a stress hormone that provides some valuable information about what someone is experiencing physiologically, as well as possibly cognitively. So interracial interaction has been found to have negative effects on controlled processing. By controlled processing, this is a cognitive psychology term that basically refers to how you process things mentally. What we're really after is, we'll mention again, is that you're looking for a state of relaxed alertness, so to speak, when you can function at your highest levels when you're doing some sort of demanding cognitive tasks. But it turns out that when you're interacting with a person of another race, according to this study that we're talking about here, that was done in 2009, cortisol levels were affected when stereotypes were introduced in a conversation. For example, a white person talking to a black person about some sort of issues where stereotypes might be brought up in the conversation, like, for example, a discussion of weapons or some other sort of thing. The cortisol levels will actually kick into gear when this happens. And it's really interesting how this happens in terms of interfering with cognitive processing tasks. If you're in an emotional state of mind, it's harder for you to do some things that are actually demanding of your processing capability in the brain. For example, when interacting with a person of another race, processing of the Stroop Color Naming Task was impacted in this particular study. Basically, you were not as able to do this task as well as you could otherwise. The Stroop task, again, as a reminder, is a psychological test, basically, where you'll be shown a bunch of words that are color names, and the color of the ink on the words might be different. For example, the word red might be printed in green ink, or the word blue might be printed in yellow ink. And sometimes you're asked to name the color of the word, or sometimes you're asked to name the word but ignore the color. So this gets in the way. It takes you a couple of seconds to think about what you're doing sometimes. And this actually gets even slower when you've just been through an experience where someone is talking about race and they're from another race, or vice versa. So this is a way of measuring cognitive processing. This slide shows us that this actually interferes with cognitive processing. So people will be thrown into an emotional state of mind when they're discussing race under certain circumstances. So this is another study. This talks about in-group advantage. This study is actually the old in-group advantage stuff that's been around for quite a while, but looked at in a different way. Basically, when you're doing these tasks, recognizing intergroup anxiety is easier in your own race group than it is in another race group. For example, if I'm a white person and I'm watching another white person in one of these horribly designed experiments that are just mean to people, and I see what's going on and they introduce some sort of racism discussion in there, I will be able to spot in my white colleague the stress that they're undergoing, the intergroup anxiety. But I would not be able to spot the same thing as easily if this was happening with a black person. Vice versa, a black person is not going to be able to see the stress that a white person is experiencing as easily as they would see the stress that a black person is experiencing in a similar kind of situation. It turns out, again, the conclusion here in this study is that only race-matched observers sensitive to cortisol reactivity, which is an internally generated response to stress, can make the determination accurately. So when you measure cortisol in these settings, the white person interacting with the black person, their cortisol is going up, but only a white person is going to be more sensitive to that than a black person watching as an observer. And the same thing with a black person interacting with a white person. A black person is going to be more sensitive to noticing the sorts of things that are related to the cortisol activity than a white person was. So basically, there's a big mismatch there. We are not seeing things that are occurring with other groups of people, and they're not seeing things that are occurring with us. And I think this is powerful information to have if you're going to start engaging in things like Black Lives Matter training or anti-racist training, understanding that people are going to be undergoing some stress, and in some cases it's going to be pretty severe. If you understand that up front, you're in a better position to facilitate these particular trainings. And by the way, these trainings should really be delivered by people who are very skilled at facilitation and can understand intergroup dynamics and can shut down any major issues that occur during trainings. So this white and black thing is not just specific to racism discussions with white and black people. This is something that happens with in-groups and out-groups everywhere, I would suggest, based on this particular study. This is a study done with Chinese and Canadians, and basically this was looking at linguistic intergroup bias, and basically cortisol samples were measured here, and the same sorts of threats were put together. And there's a technical term called area under the curve they use to measure stress in these groups. There's conditions where there was some sort of bias or threat proposed, and if you were somebody who was in sort of a racist form of mind, where they had a separate measure in these studies where you had some racist ideas, the stress would actually show up at even greater levels if there was a threat. Like, for example, if you look at that middle set of bars, this is a condition where people were not threatened versus they were threatened. The more racist you are, the bottom line, this is a complicated experiment, but the bottom line is the more racist your beliefs are as measured by a linguistic test, the more likely it is you're going to react to stress. This was some experiment done with people were derogating the other group in terms of stereotypes and that sort of thing. You can see that the stress that occurred when you knew you were going to be interacting with somebody was greater if you had some racist ideas. So very important to know if you're confronting a group with racist sort of presuppositions up front, you need to know that the reaction can be more extreme than you might expect.
They also went into all sorts of observations in this study, which is definitely worth looking at. White observers noticed an increase in vocal tension when white participants were faced with interracial encounters, while black observers sensed the opposite, which is interesting. Black observers noticed an increase in reassurance seeking among black participants paired with white interviewers, but white observers were basically oblivious to that. There was a greater vocal tension for white participants who feared appearing prejudiced and greater reassurance seeking for black participants who feared appearing unintelligent and incompetent. And then the results sustained and the results here suggest a sustaining meaningful interracial contact, which can reduce racial prejudice, is actually something to look at. And this is something, if you go back to the work of Walter and Cookie Stephan, they were on this back in the 80s. They knew that there was something going on here. And basically, you can start to break down this emotion recognition gap by having groups work together. And it's so powerful that even if you have people do imagery, you can get them to work together. Readings alone is probably not going to work. You want to set up some settings where people are actually interacting across group boundaries on some tasks that are meaningful and get people to get to know each other. I'd like to also mention this intergroup anxiety stuff is not an excuse for white people. We need to deal with the racism in our system. It's ingrained in our culture. It's ingrained in our system. There are so many indicators that it's there. We know that income levels are different. We know that home ownership is different. We know that education levels are different. We know that success in high school is different. We know that test scores are different. In fact, we've even done studies through our equity work over the last 30 years indicating that the kinds of attention that kids get in classrooms from teachers is a big predictor of this particular bias. For example, the Asian students and the white students are a whole lot more likely to be asked to answer higher order thinking skills than Black students or Hispanic students or Native American students. And in contrast, the Black students, the Native American students, and the Hispanic students are a lot more likely to be asked basic factual recall questions. So what's going on here is that we don't think teachers are intentionally looking to be racist or biased. What they're doing is they're asking students questions they think they can answer. They don't want to embarrass Black students or Hispanic students or students who are Native American by asking them the questions they don't think they can answer, so they just stick to the basics, while the Asian students and the white students are challenged. They're actually asked higher order thinking questions, and it's persistent throughout the whole system. It's just one manifestation. At one point we thought maybe this caused later issues, but it's so ingrained in the system that we really need to deal with this head on. And we don't get to use intergroup anxiety as an excuse. We have to deal with this now. Racism is persistent in our society. Whites continue to benefit from the system whether they want to admit it or not. And I've certainly benefited from white privilege. Even though I grew up in poverty, I had all kinds of benefits that I never realized. I was able to get into schools and do things in classrooms and function in meetings in ways that people in other groups were not. And it was basically a function of the system. I didn't quite realize that until I started getting into this. But I'd have to admit that I did benefit. Some say that if you are not actively working to dismantle the system, you are part of the problem. That really got me thinking. You know, I would say some of the things that we talked about before, that, if you only knew me, you'd know that I've worked on this since I was in the 5th grade and all this kind of stuff. Well, unless you are really into this and you're not doing something that really costs you, you're not making a difference. In my own personal experience, I've been kicked off of state committees because of my attitudes about equity and racism. I've had lawyers call my boss because I would say things about racism and equity that they did not like. I lost a job because of my positions about racism and equity. I was working with a supervisor one time, and I pointed out that disciplinary rates for Hispanics were much higher than they were for white students. And the guy said, well, what if they're all carrying knives? That did not go well for me after that. And if you have not paid with those sorts of circumstances by speaking up, you're not making a difference. You really need to step up and take this on. So helping by looking at intergroup anxiety, this helps us move forward. By understanding how different groups react to intergroup anxiety, we can anticipate some of the challenges to deal with them, as I've been mentioning before. To solve complex problems, we need to be in a state of relaxed alertness. This is kind of like the higher order thinking skills brain. Hammond mentions that phrase, and I thought that was a very interesting kind of phrase. We've heard things like flow mentioned, that kind of stuff. When you're relaxed and you're alert and you're not stressed, that's when you do your best cognitive work. So we need to think about being in that state of mind and not get wrapped up in all the emotions if we're going to solve these problems. We have to deal with this head on. And that's going to take some work. This is not an easy problem to solve. You're not going to deal with this in one workshop. It's a lot of work, and we have to work on ourselves first. Here are some possible strategies that have been mentioned to reduce intergroup anxiety. Intergroup interaction skills. By being able to interact with other groups, we're going to be able to reduce this anxiety and make the world a better place. Communication styles, understanding that different groups communicate in different ways. They're not bad or good, they're not better or worse, they're just different. And we need to start understanding that our way is not the only way. There are lots of good ways to do things, and we can learn a lot from other cultures and other groups. Cognitive and emotional empathy. We need to start understanding at higher levels what's going on with us and how we're interacting with other groups and what's going on with other groups. And understand that there is nothing wrong with the other groups. It might be something wrong with us. And then also we want to take a look at information that counteracts perceived realistic and symbolic threats. That means start pulling things apart and say, hey, what's really behind this attitude or this perception? Why am I thinking this way, or why do people do that? We need to really start thinking at deeper levels to understand the backgrounds of what goes on. Other things that have been mentioned in the research, changing intergroup cognitions, we talked about that, reducing negative affect and emotions, increasing intergroup contact. That's from the Stephans. Very important strategy there. I know that I've experienced this in my life. I mentioned that I've been, at least I thought I was working on equity issues since I was in the 6th grade. My mother was a Head Start teacher back in the 60s during the War on Poverty, and she would drag me to the Head Start Center in the summertime to keep her eye on me. And I was obviously exposed to some intergroup contact and learned a whole lot there, and kept on going. I was very interested in equity issues from that point on, and kept on working on myself and working on systems from that point on. But one of the things that really made a difference for me was intergroup contact. As I became more familiar with people from other groups, I became more comfortable, and I was able to interact in different ways, and I understand what bias is in a way, and I understand that I'm going to make a racist comment here and there, and I need to continually check myself. What is really earth-shattering is when your daughter comes up to you and says, "Dad, that's racist." My daughter is an administrator in a public school in the area, and she's been through all sorts of workshops, and actually she probably knows more about some of this stuff than I do. And when she calls me on that, it really hits home. Managing the situations in which contact occurs. Of course, you can set up some circumstances, things like cooperative learning. Cookie Stephan was involved in that many years ago before it became popular. These sorts of things actually make a difference. Changing behaviors toward outgroup members, and also modifying personality traits and in-group identification. This means trying to work on some of the more stable things like racism, bias, and that sort of thing, and deal with this head on. And of course, that takes some work. That's not easily done. So again, I'd like you to stop. We've given you a lot of information here to process. And actually, if we're going to make a difference, we need to start preparing to deal with intergroup anxiety. And of course, this is going to be different in every setting. Some of you might be working in higher education. Some of you might be working at district levels or at regional levels. Some of you might be working at school building levels. And some of you might be working in classrooms or with parents or younger students. So what we'd like to do is have you take about 5 minutes again and just be honest with us. Talk about the challenges you face as you prepare to address intergroup anxiety in your settings. And please feel free to make any comments you like in the chat, and we'll give you about 5 minutes there. So thank you again for your comments. This is a challenging topic, and it's very difficult to deal with this, but there is no time like the present to start to understand some of these issues. Moving on, a lot of resources were mentioned. Here are the major ones. These are the articles that I cited for a lot of the particular examples I mentioned in here. You'll see the Stephan's articles are in there. You'll also see some of the studies that we talked about at great length there. Difficult topic, and this is just a scratching of the surface. I also encourage you to go back and look at the Black Lives Matter canon. Those books are also useful as well, if you're not already familiar with that work. So again, if you have any other concerns or comments, I would love to hear from you. Here's my contact information. Again, you can email us or go to our website and learn more about what the Equity Center does. And you can also feel free to call and leave a message, and I'll get back to you. Questions, concerns, if you want more information about anything, or if you're interested in any other equity related topics, we would love to hear from you. Thanks again for your time, and go forth and advocate, and hopefully we can make the world a better place.